All right, my name is Andrew Holbrook. I'm here at Edgewood College on December 12th, 2024 with.
Kathleen Kelm.
Thank you very much for taking some time to record this oral history.
It's a pleasure. My first degree is actually in history and linguistics, so it's certainly a far cry from computer science, which of course is what my discipline is. But I do recognize and appreciate the importance of capturing in real time what people remember and how people can then talk about who they were and who they are now as a result of a place that they spent a lot of time with, which of course is Edgewood College for me.
That's a wonderful sentiment to bring to our conversation. Thank you. Let's go back to the beginning a little bit.
Sure.
Could you tell me where you're from originally and where you grew up?
I am a Canadian. I moved to Wisconsin in 1997. I lived in the province of Ontario, and so I am a product of the Canadian educational system, which turned out to be quite an interesting challenge for me when I came to Edgewood, because, of course, I knew nothing about liberal arts colleges. I certainly knew nothing about the Dominican educational environment. And so it was a steep learning curve for me because I was trying to figure out what was this place and what did it represent. In Canada, most of the small, what we refer to as liberal arts colleges, were absorbed in the 1960s, were absorbed into the public university system. And so the style of university is a little different. So yes, if you went to the University of Toronto, which I went to, there would have been colleges, references to colleges that if you dug into their history, you would have found out that they were affiliated with a religious organization of some sort of denomination. My undergraduate degree is from the University of Windsor. And so I knew a lot about the Roman Catholic Basilican Fathers, who were the originators of the Assumption College, which eventually became the University of Windsor in the 60s. So there are connections, but the approach is very different, and you just simply don't have liberal arts colleges in Canada like you do here. I got here in 1997, and how I found Edgewood was a complete happenstance. People always think it's such a funny story how it happened, but I was living outside of Economilloc, so a bit of a journey from here. And I received a phone call one day from actually a undergraduate, who was looking for someone to teach a networking class. So a faculty person had left the department. At that time, it was math and computer science. And they were frantically looking for somebody who could teach a networking class at night. And so after I said, what about me? And she said, oh, well, that's a great idea. Here's the name of a person, go meet with him. So his name was John Schaff. I did meet with John. It took me a while to find the place because at that time, as you know, we didn't originally have Edgewood College Drive. The way you got to Edgewood College is through Woodrow Street. And not being from Wisconsin and not being from Madison, I had no idea where the college was. I did get told to take the Beltline and get off at Seminole Highway and then turn right onto Nakoma. And I did that and went right by the college because at that time Predlin wasn't even up yet. Got as far as Camp Randall and realized must have gone too far. Asked somebody at Camp Randall and they told me where to get here. Anyway, I got here, so I was late and was agreed with somebody who said, right, here's the textbook. If you don't like it, find a different one or don't use it. It's a 3-hour class at night on Tuesdays. If you finish early, don't worry. And I started the following Tuesday. So that was Friday. I started the next Tuesday. Now, I tell that story because that is the epitome of what not to do with an adjunct faculty member, which is basically give them free rein because there are assessments you're supposed to meet, etc. But fortunately, I actually was a networking expert in my field, and I'm a computer person. And so it wasn't very difficult, but I came waltzing in, not knowing anything about Edgewood College and nothing about the degree program, and had 23 people in my class. So I just kind of wung it the first couple of weeks. The third week, and things seemed to be going okay. After all, I didn't know the topic area. Third weekend, somebody shows up in the back of my class. Now, I'm not quite sure if this is somebody who just joined the class or whoever it is. So I walk up very nicely and say, hello, my name is Kathleen Kelm. Who are you? And he says, well, I'm Stephen Post, the chair of the department. I'm here to evaluate you. To which my response was, well, that's great, Stephen. It's week 3, and I always ask for a very simple evaluation. As soon as I collect them, I'll hand them over to you. And I turned on my heels and walked back to the class. And as I'm walking back to the front, I said, well, I guess I have to be nice to him. He's the chair of the department. Now, you can only imagine the students were all returning owls. They all laughed. And Stephen walked into John's office the next morning, I found out, and said, who is this person and why have you hired her? So my start here at Edgewood was probably the most not the right way to go ever. But about halfway through the semester, Stephen sent me an email. I picked it up, actually. It was at a client's. And it started with, there is an open position. Why don't you apply for it? And so I dutifully wrote him back. And I do actually still have the email. The subject line was 14 reasons why you don't want to hire me. And listed 14 reasons, the top of which was, I'm not a traditional academic. Now, at that time, I had 3 siblings. They were all in academia. I was the renegade. I'd gone into the computer field. And so I actually knew a little bit about what it would mean to be in the academic world. And I wasn't quite sure I really fit it. And Stephen's response was, well, that's fine, but could you apply anyway? I ended up applying, and I ended up coming here full-time in 1998. And my very first day, Sister Marion Hardy, who was in the math side of the math and computer science department, sat me down and proceeded to tell me the story of the faculty mutiny, which had to do with the fact the faculty had decided that they felt Sister Mary Evans wasn't working very well as a president and thought it'd be better to get someone new. And at the time, we happened to have one of the sisters came in, took over part-time. And that was my introduction to the sisters, which was, again, very unusual because here I am. I don't know anything about the liberal arts system. I know nothing about Dominican education. I've kind of figured out at Edgewood College a little bit. And now I'm hearing story about the faculty mutiny. And I'm thinking, what place have I entered? Anyway, the bottom line was it was a good fit for me because there's more to this college than meets the eyes. People may walk in here and think, state, academia, Dominican college. No, I think we have quite a history. We have quite a history, and the sisters are part of it. I used to always say that my very first year I survived because of the sisters. Because I really did feel like a duck out of water here. And that was because I really didn't know much about what it meant to be an academic. And I was viewed with suspicion a little bit because how could I have left a very lucrative IT computer job to take this not really well-paying job? Because you don't do this for the money, obviously. You do it because you love the work. But Sister Mary Painter stopped me one day in the quad, and she said, I hear you're the one that uses scented markers. Now, I didn't know who Sister Mary Painter was. But I recognized that I figured she might be a sister. And so I said, yes, I am. I introduced myself. She introduced herself. She says, well, I think you ought to have a brown bag explaining why you use that technique in teaching. I also heard you use a chat room. I'd like you to talk about that as well. Now, this is 1998, so that was a pretty radical thing. And I said, okay. And next thing I know, I'm now presenting to a bunch of faculty about some of these, what at the time seemed to be very unusual teaching techniques. They're not in the corporate world, but they were here at that time. And so whenever I wasn't quite sure, invariably one of the sisters would snag me somewhere and just check in on me and see how I was doing. And that's why I always say my first year, in many ways, the sisters kind of saved me from saying, this is just too different. But I grew to love what this college represents, the values it represents, what we do with our students. But I came in as a stranger. I didn't know anything about the Dominican values. I didn't understand the Edgewood College values. I didn't really know what Dominican consensus meant. Mm-hmm. But I learned about study, reflect, and act on behalf of others. And I have steadfastly used that for the rest of my life. I will use it for the rest of my life. I certainly use it in my teaching. I use it in my work, my outreach work in the community. I often talk about how important it is to be engaged, but don't do it because you're helping somebody else. Do it because it's part of your own life. And I think that blessing that the sisters gave us in helping us orient ourselves towards the idea of studying, reflecting on what we're learning, and then using what we learn as an act for others is a gift that has enriched not only ourselves, but it's also enriched our students. And so we have used that quite a lot. In 1999, we had just finished our accreditation, 10-year accreditation. And one of the things that they said was they wanted to see the programs themselves, the degree programs, be more strongly assessed. So we'd have better criteria. And so I was given that job to do. Thank you very much, John Schaff. So I went out looking for a standard that I could then benchmark our degree program against. And one of the things I noticed that we didn't have a capstone project, which was a typical thing that I was used to in the corporate world, but I had not seen it anywhere else. And so I reinvented a class, a capstone class. And the idea was that they would complete a project. But because this is a Dominican institution, I felt it was important that whatever project they did would be a service project. Now, again, that's nothing radical now, but at the time it really was. And so we looked for a partner that would be a safe partner, meaning the students, after all, are still students. They're not in the profession yet, so to speak. But I really wanted them to experience what it meant to be in community and to do service work that they would learn from, and that they would learn from the people that they were doing the service work. And that's actually where CS 492 came from. It ended up being a model for the Core 3 project that we now use as part and parcel of our general education. And we've been doing that since 1999. So there is an example of where the Dominican education and the Dominican approach to education has been substantively integrated into curriculum in a way that nobody would, well, of course you're going to do a project. Why would you not do a project like that? But in actual fact, it was an intentional decision. The sisters very much wanted me to go to the colloquiums that are run every few years to talk about how I've integrated study, reflect, and act into the curriculum. Because there's always been that conversation that says, well, you have to meet a licensing requirement, or you have to meet a particular assessment criteria that's been imposed by higher ed, or whatever, and we can't do that. Well, I disagree. I think very much you can do that. And you can do that and help the students see that as a pivotal shift in how they see themselves as, in this case, computing professionals. One of the most interesting conversations I ever had was with Vince Kavalowski, God rest his soul, who was the head of philosophy here at Edgewood College. Back in the old days, and I mean 1998, 99, 1000, we didn't have a faculty lounge. So this building wasn't here. We're in Predlin building, in case you're wondering. And so as a result, we were in this goofy little room down in the old wing of Predlin before it was rebuilt. And we used to have wine and cheese nights, which we don't have very often here. Maybe we should. Anyway, I sat down. Vince introduced himself. I introduced myself, and he looked at me a little askance and said, well, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of room for philosophy with a computer degree. And I looked at Vince, and I said, well, I'm not sure I agree with you, Vince. And here's why. And then I started to explain a little bit about computers and ethics. Now, again, not that radical for me to think about it, but certainly, I guess, something hadn't been discussed very much here. And at the end of the conversation, he said, we ought to have these wine and cheese more often. I had no idea how integrated philosophical approaches were when it came to thinking about ethical use of technology. I said, well, and I really appreciate and enjoy the fact that I had a conversation about some of the tenets, the core tenets of ethics and philosophy, et cetera. As we were working through some reworking of the degree programs, especially from the gen ed side of it, every once in a while I'd hear Vince say, no, I don't agree with that. I think if you went and talked to the computer science department, you would find out that they actually have integrated really well the concepts of philosophy and ethics into their degree program. I would just hear these out of nowhere. Because I think that when you have a place like this, where you have clearly professional degrees, and you have this requirement for liberal arts education, but they don't have to sit and work against each other. They can work together in a way that requires some thoughtful study, reflect, and act kind of activities, and that's an ongoing thing. It's not something you can do just off the top of your head. It's a journey. We always talk about life as a journey. Well, the journeys can incorporate new angles or new ways of thinking. And maybe it's because, and I appreciate the fact that, we've been talking about the women at Edgewood. I especially appreciate it because as a woman in a field that is still very underrepresented, where I would be the only person in the room for a long time, a bunch of men and me, that we are particularly focused on the importance of having diverse viewpoints. And having diverse viewpoints, not just because we're required to or we're supposed to, but because the life is so much better. Our ideas, hearing from other perspectives that are gender, racial, culture, that aspect of a diverse life. Our lives themselves are enriched. And if the sisters have done anything else, they set that platform for us. And it's up to us to continue it. That's what it means to be at a Dominican institution. When you talk to other people at other Dominican institutions, you see that commonality come out. That we aren't just here to disperse knowledge. We're here to be part of that learning journey with our students. So I came here, there were a lot of women. First time in my life I ever worked where there were a lot of women. I remember thinking how odd it was that I was here where there were a lot of women, as opposed to my normal life where I was maybe one or two.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm really glad you brought that up, and as well about your learning journey, because I wanted to ask you more about the origins of some of the threads that came together for you later on as someone who has both academic and corporate backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
Could I ask you to take me through a little bit your schooling and your intellectual interests when you were younger, because they sound very diverse as well.
I think you ask a question, and it's an interesting conversation to have. So I grew up outside of the Windsor area. So we were not part of the city of Windsor. We're actually south, as you probably, if you look at the geography, you'll know. Detroit is actually north of Windsor, right? It's the only place where the U.S. is north of Canada. And we had a very, somewhat limited school system at the time because we were out in the country. And so my parents, along with other parents, banded together to provide some enrichment for our children, for their children. And so, for example, my brother, who was musically gifted, they brought in somebody to teach music. They brought somebody in. So the parents paid for this. And so what happened was at the age of 8, they had arranged to have a French teacher come in after school. So we had in our simple educational system a real focus for art, music, and language. So I started speaking French, je parle français. I started speaking French from the age of 8. And it wasn't just because French is the same language as English from a standing in Canada, but the parents really felt it was important that the children learned or had an exposure to an educational system that was well-rounded. And so as a result, I went to a grade school, because that's what they're called in Canada, is grade schools. I went to a grade school, and there was an emphasis that you were really educating the whole child. When I went to high school, my natural tendencies in high school were towards language because obviously I had already been exposed to speaking a second language. And so I pursued an educational environment that was rich in language, rich in history, because that was my personal interest, rich in art. The Canadians in the Ontario system at the time was actually 5 years in high school, the 5th year being the equivalent of first-year university. And so as a result, if you got your degree at the end of 4 years, but if you wanted to stay for an extra year, it was a year that was counted towards your undergraduate degree. So that's the route I went. They built a new high school, and so I had to change high schools at the end of the second year. And then the 5th year, they didn't have Latin. I was studying Latin through, and I wanted my Latin, so I had to switch back to my original high school. So I studied my high school education is a couple of histories, 4 languages, including Latin, so je parle français. I studied Spanish and also German. Fairly fluent in German, but Spanish. At one point in time, I was trilingual, Spanish and French. And I had an art focus. And so as a result, I really had what I have now learned to be a very strong liberal arts education. I had advanced math, always interested in physics, a crazy person. Like, how can you be an artsy person and be a physics person? But apparently it does happen because I was that kind of person. Went off to university, did my first degree in history at the University of Windsor in history, Canadian history, and linguistics, teaching a second language. And what was interesting about it was the fact that I was part of the Canadian government initiative to welcome new Canadians and offer English language on Saturday mornings. And so I was teaching English as a second language. I remember teaching it, walking away the very first day and thinking, wow, that was a lot of fun, because you could see this learning happening instantaneously. With children, it's over time. With grown-ups, it's real time, you know? And so my background, ironically enough, has nothing to do with what I ended up doing for a living. My background was very much a liberal arts background. Now, I asked my colleagues here at Edgewood one day, I said, I don't have a degree in computer science, because I don't, as a matter of fact, which is a bit odd given what I teach. I said, why do you think that I was able to adapt so well into this field? Because I fell into it quite by accident. And they said, well, what's your educational background? And I said, well, advanced math, advanced physics, I see that. And they looked at me and they said, yeah, but you're not counting the languages. You realize that you learned all the math you need for computers, and you learned all the language only you didn't learn programming languages, you learned verbal languages, but it's the same thing. And you had a brother who's a musician, and everybody knows music and computers are a very tight fit. So it's no surprise that you ended up in computing as a profession.
Mm-hmm.
Because I actually was an accountant. When I finished my undergraduate degree, I went in and I became an accountant. Because the thing about numbers, they always work when you're an accountant, right? And the only reason I ended up in computing is because my husband, the father of my children, got a gig supporting somebody who had written accounting software that had an inventory control system, and it would work on a Xerox system that had a single-sided, single-density 8-inch diskettes back in those days, and also double-sided double density. And that was great. The software apparently was going to work, but nobody knew how to use it. But I was an accountant. Would I be interested in coming and helping do that? So I fell into working with computers only because I happened to be an accountant. And then, of course, we moved from 8-inch diskettes to 5.25-inch diskettes. And there's a small problem, they don't fit. And so I sat one evening with the programmer, and we literally used X on, X off, which is a bit translator, and we jerry-rigged 2 serial cables. And we managed to get the software over many hours, got the software over to the 5.25-inch diskette. I'm also the first person who ever installed a local area network in Canada. That's the first head of IT, female head of IT in Canada. I worked directly with IBM Canada at a time when they didn't hire anyone who hadn't worked at IBM first, because they realized they had an educational service that wasn't doing very well. They were getting feedback like, great course, no idea what to do with it. And getting hired to do that and basically convert everything. I got a phone call one day from Austin, Texas. And I answered the phone. I happened to be sitting at an IBM phone. And they said, is this Kathleen Kelm? Yes. Are you for real? I think so. Just checking myself. I'm real. And I said, who is this? And I said, so-and-so from Austin, Texas. We just looked at your course material. We can't believe you actually teach this way. Yeah, so I teach. How do you make it work? Could you come down and explain to us how it works? Okay, so the next thing I know, I'm down in Austin, Texas. I've been all over Canada, the United States, doing computer work. So when I moved to Wisconsin, that's what I did. I came here and was doing computer work. And that's how this Edgewood College graduate found me, because I had been doing some consulting work for her. But don't have a degree in computer science, strangely enough. Figured it out. One of the things I tell students all the time, if you want to never be bored, this is the field for you. But you will never know everything. And you have to be okay with it. Because you will never know anything. When I can tell, so I asked the students actually just a couple of years ago when I was in teaching here, I asked them, I said, I have a concern. I said that I'm getting to a point in age-wise that am I relevant to you anymore? And they all looked at me and said, well, actually, yeah, because we don't know anybody else who can actually tell us what it was like when Wi-Fi first came out. Like, that's really interesting to hear how it works, because you actually know how it works, because you actually did that. And we didn't know who actually was the inventor of Wi-Fi. Like, that's fascinating. I mean, they just said, no. The fact that you're at that time, I was 70 years old, because I'm 71 now, so it was last year. And they said, no, the fact that you're 70, like, you've seen all this stuff. That's amazing. We just take it all for granted now. But you could actually walk us through and explain how it works. Okay, I guess, okay. I'll keep doing it. If you ask, I'll tell you. You know? I also got asked another interesting question. Last year, when a couple of the liberal arts colleges here in the independent colleges closed down, one of the students put their hand up and said, do you think this place is going to survive? You've been here a long time. Do you think this place is going to survive? And I looked at him and I said, yes, I do. Let me tell you why. Because when you leave this place, you will not only have earned a degree, you will have come to understand what it means to be part of the community, whatever community that turns out to be. Not many places that know how to bring that into a degree program. And what I see that piece of Edgewood College. It has been a consistent piece since it was first started. I said, and there are a lot of places that can do that. You're really part of community here, aren't you? You might be part of different communities here, but you do feel like you're a member of the community, don't you? Yeah. That's why I think Edgewood's still relevant and still going to survive.
Boy, that's fascinating.
They're very thoughtful. These students are very thoughtful. They're thoughtful for lots of reasons. They're thoughtful because they've been through a pandemic and nobody saw it coming. Should we have? I don't know. There's lots of people that say we should have, actually. But they went through what is a traumatic event, not unlike what some of the students went through in 2001. Those students that went through September 11th, it changed how they thought about things. Because there was this piece of security they always taken for granted, got snuffed away. In the same way, the pandemic did the same thing for these students. I've never had a student tell me they're not going to be here because their parents arranged for a vacation and they're going on it. Usually it's the opposite, right? I'm going on my vacation. You guys go do your thing. No, I've had students say, I'm going away with my parents and I won't get back until I'll miss a class. Would that be okay? What should I do to prepare? They don't just come in and tell me. Maybe that's the gift. I don't know. I can't speak for any faculty other than myself, but I can tell you my students would always come and tell me. I had all the student athletes come up and say, okay, here's our schedule. This is what might happen. I said, now you realize you'll be away for the week before March break. Oh, we will? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. This is the baseball team. I said, so they usually have midterm, so we're going to have to arrange to have the midterm at a different time. So they don't just say, oh, well, I'm not here. Well, there's a reason. I can look at other places and students will just not show. Not true with most of the students I've had at Edgewood. That means they must care or they wouldn't bother. Now, why do they care? They care because they know they're part of a community here. This is how we see this idea of community coming out in how the students think of themselves and how they think about their role in that classroom or cross classrooms, their particular demographic. It's a life that is very hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. Most people just kind of go, it's college. Well, this place is special. It's college, don't get me wrong. And it doesn't mean that every student feels that way. But I will tell you, my daughter her first degree is from here, Edgewood College. She chose to come here. She had other places she wanted to go. And she got a lot of pushback from her friends who went to UW. And she finally just looked down one day and said, look, I'm not going here because my mother's here. I'm going here because of what I would see in my mother's face when she'd come home from work. That meant that there had to be something else about this place than just going to university. And for the record, when she went to do her master's degree, there were very few that were allowed to do her degrees in psychology. There were very few allowed to do a quantitative research study this is at university, because most master's students can't do quantitative studies very well. But on the strength of her work here at Edgewood as an undergraduate student and the research she did here, she's one of the few that were allowed to do a qualitative study. So it's really interesting to see how the careful consideration of curriculum here actually allowed my daughter to fulfill her research requirement in a way that very few students are allowed to do at the master's level. Because qualitative research is a little tricky because of its subjective nature. So there's more precision required. It's easy to do, it's not easy to do stats, but it's easy to do stats. Much harder to do qualitative research. Mm-hmm. So Edgewood's kind of an interesting place. It's got lots of challenges, sure. And have I had any regret? No, I don't think so, because in 2017, I was asked to come and teach one class at the last minute because somebody wasn't going to be here that was originally supposed to teach it. And then I ended up coming back for 2 years. So I retired in 2014, had a great party that I did not ask for. I had people come. I had students arrive that I had to frantically try to remember their names after many years. We had a great time. Retired, went off to do some corporate work again. And then in 2017, I came back here again for 2 years, full time, took over as chair. They had to come up with a new category at HR. I was telling you that called re-retire. I re-retired in 2019, and then I have come back in other years and taught one class here, one class there. It's a hard place. It's a hard place. Somebody asked me one time, financially, you don't necessarily make a lot of money here as a faculty member. And so it's not surprising that faculty find other work to do in consulting work and things like that, or adjunct work elsewhere. It's not a surprise. So their former dean of students, the retired dean of students, Maggie Bellastory-Clark, another great Edgewood woman, asked me one day. I went to talk to her about I was concerned financially, and she said, "Can you find something else to support your Edgewood habit?" And I looked at her and said, "Well, I'm going to try." And what I ended up doing is taking on a part-time position teaching for the University of Liverpool online. They were just starting a computer science program, master's program. So I applied for it, started in 2002, and I have been doing it ever since. I'm still doing it now. And I've had situations where I have had students here benefit from my students there, and my students there benefiting from my students here. We have had moments where I've had students not believe me here, that my students there actually do kind of know who I am, to the point where one day I pulled up a chat box, caught one of my students online, said, "You got a minute? Would you mind if I ask you a couple of questions? Here's the situation. Would you mind if I just put it up on the screen so they can see what your response is?" And he said, "Yeah, no problem." He happened to be in India at the time, just to let you know where he was. Anyway, so first question they asked, typed it in, describe Kathleen. And he described me, energetic, interesting, lots of stories, background, blah, blah, blah. Just basic. And they were all like this because they couldn't believe that he was articulating the essence of who I was without ever having met me. But it's because when you engage, and you have to do it through online means, you have to rethink how you do that. Because you have to be who you are, right? Mm. I had an Edgewood College student here who was from Beijing, really homesick, wanted to go home and not stay to do her master's degree. So I got a hold of one of my master's students, female, also in Beijing. "Do you have any advice you could share?" She wrote out some advice to my student. She stayed, did her master's degree. Those connections, they're hard to imagine you would ever have, but they happen. Mm-hmm. I had one of my honors students do some research on some group dynamic work that was going on in my online classroom. And of course, the benefit my students have here is they hear about what's going on around the world. I mean, I have taught students in my online degree program. I have students I gave up after 106 countries. So, wow. And I used to supervise faculty from over 75 countries. And so, between the faculty and the students, you get a window into the world. And of course, my Edgewood College students automatically then had a window into this world. So when we first talked about redoing the degree program back in 2017, Audrey Sinha, another great Edgewood woman, she said, "Well, what would you ask your online students what they're doing around the world?" I said, "Sure." So I put it out there, and they said, "Well, you know what? Really, your students need to learn Python." Okay. Audrey, they say students should learn Python as their very first programming language. Okay, let's do that. Of course, our students learn Python as their first programming language. That came directly from me doing a poll with my online students who are working professionals doing a second degree. What they say the students at 18, 19 should learn.
Mm-hmm.
What a fascinating life I have. Really, truly. I mean, we just, like, I think I sit back and reflect on it as I did before I came here. And what would be interesting for people to know about what it means to be part of this community? You know, it's an amazing thing.
Those are some powerful connections you've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, you brought up the supervising faculty.
Mm-hmm.
And I am curious, after hearing some of your really fascinating stories about students, I'm curious if I could ask you a little bit about your work as a faculty member and as a department chair, and through committees and other means at Edgewood. What were some of the most important programs or curriculum initiatives that you were involved with here at the college?
Well, now that there's two things. I was reflecting on my work as someone involved with faculty work. And so once I got used to the fact that here in the academic world, there is value in just talking. Of course, I come from the corporate world where you come into a meeting, you have an agenda, you have things to do, and you leave to go do them, right? Well, here it's a little different. Sometimes you just sit and talk, which was very confusing to me, but I did get used to it. But there were some things that came out of working with faculty. First of all, after they got over the fact that I was really somebody that they could talk with, because there were a lot of people who weren't really quite sure about me the first couple of years. And then over time, what happened was I found that if I were involved in committees, then I would learn about the faculty needs. Listening is still an art and a skill that not a lot of people have. And so for me, I didn't know much about what it meant to be a faculty member here. And so by listening, I learned a great deal about their concerns. The first piece that really got me more in terms of a profile was when we had a summer activity that involved the liberal arts side of the house and the professional side of the house. They weren't getting along very well, and we wanted to revisit our degree program. We wanted to revisit our gen ed. But the only way we could do that is by taking down those barriers and accepting the fact that they were mutually beneficial. And so I worked with Fred Coffin, a dear colleague, who he represented comm arts and I represented computer science. And technically they were not really in the same house, if you think about it. And so we ended up working together and leading a group over the course of a summer where we opened up and activated the dialogue that really needed to happen about we not only need to coexist, but we are mutually beneficial to each other. But we're doing this in service of the students. So how do we put curriculums together where the students don't look at Jenna and say, oh, I just want to get this out of the way. But we also have to honor the fact that the nursing program has a very specific set of accreditation criteria that must be completed. And in order to do that, they have to get most of the gen eds out of the way because they can't get into the nursing side until they get the gen eds. Or at that time, we still had very strict Department of Education guidelines that we had to follow. And so we couldn't just be arbitrary in how we did it. And so that meant that we had to be flexible enough in the way we designed the gen ed to accommodate the unique needs of different departments or different divisions. And so that first experience for me helped me then understand the importance of consensus and the importance of dialogue, but most importantly, the importance of first listening before speaking. I can think of somebody who started the art therapy program here. Her name is L'Oreal Newsom. And she passed away about a year after I started here. But I can still visually remember Lori Ellen sitting in a faculty meeting, and the place would go quiet when she spoke. Same thing with Sister Esther Heffernan. There were individuals who knew the importance of listening and then offering their thoughts after there'd been a fair amount of conversations. I took that gift that they gave me and used it and incorporated it over and over again in my work with other faculty. So yes, I used to run professional development presentations. When we started the faculty colloquium, a lot of promoting of doing that. When Dean Primino was here and he started the Engaged Fellows, I was one of the original Engaged Fellows, where we worked to support faculty research. Challenge about being at a teaching university is the fact that you don't have time to research. And so you end up scurrying around all summer trying to do your research project, and you get new academics, newly graduated PhDs coming in, and they don't want to let their research go, but we're expecting them to teach so many credits. How do they still manage? Like, how can you find a way for them to continue their research, but using students to help, for example? So we had a lot of conversations about that for a while. When I was interim dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, we had a lot of fun getting people to see that music and computers got along, and comm arts and science got along, and there was value in doing biology and also hanging out with a bunch of art people at the same time. And we went up to the Painted Forest for our retreat. Why? Because very few people had been there unless you were in the art department. And I thought that was a shame. So we commandeered a couple of the athletic vans and went up there and spent the day out there. Those activities, that type of leadership is needed. And I was lucky, I was fortunate and not lucky, fortunate that I was one of those leaders. When we had a problem with retention rate went down. And so we sat and said, okay, what is it? What happened? Why did the students not see it valuable to stay here? And so we hunkered down with Maggie Belisari-Clark and Mary Cullen Powell, and we sat down and said, right, what's the scaffolding that we need to revisit for our students? Well, the scaffolding, we call it advising. So how can we rethink our advising structure as a way to scaffold the students, to help them understand the transition between freshman and sophomore to junior and junior to senior? What are those things that we could be doing to help students see that when they're scared, freshmen, which is typically what they are, and then they get to sophomore and they're just slumping because, oh man, I got another 2 years to go. And then they're juniors, oh my goodness, I'm going out in a year. We call them the junior jitters. And then you have really bad case of senioritis, like I really want to get out of here. Recognize that. So if we pivot and start thinking about what the student development side, well, academics generally like to look at student development people and say, oh yeah, that's your thing. Well, no, actually it's our thing. So that was, again, another project where we sat down and thought about what's our purpose here and what are the things that we're doing that is not necessarily helping the student. And then the other one I want to speak to, and ironically, it's kind of an ironic thing, but one of my very first part-time job was at a library. And so I have this intense love for libraries because if you hang out in a library for 5 years working, you get to learn a lot, right? And so as a result, when I got here, I met up with the librarian at the time, Mary Jane Sheridan, and I got to know the American Library Association. See, I didn't know a whole lot about that because being from Canada. And at the time, they were working on the notion of information literacy and the notion that the library was more than books. The library is really community. And that has fed me in how I see the library. It's nurtured me, been a big promoter of information literacy. As a matter of fact, I was the one that wrote the information literacy piece for the revised Gen Ed, so that students might know how to use a computer, but that's not actually what they needed to learn. They need to understand the notion of information. They need to be better with information literacy. And that continues even to this day, because I'm the vice president of the Sun Prairie Library Foundation. We just finished wrapping up our capital campaign. We're expanding our library because our libraries are heart and soul of our community in Sun Prairie. So you see how this little journey, as all this work that I've done here at Edgewood, has helped scaffold me in some of the community service work that I do in the city of Sun Prairie and being part of the Library Board Foundation. And we just happened to have our strategic planning meeting this morning, and I told them, I asked for their permission that I would mention something about that as we were, talking about what are the things that I've done here at Edgewood. And that's one of them.
That's wonderful. I want to finish our conversation looking towards the future, because when we were talking before this interview, you spoke about the gift that the sisters had left to us broadly in the form of Edgewood College. And I would love to end our conversation hearing some of your reflections on how best to continue the giving of that gift into the future of the college and perhaps soon to be university.
Yes. That's been done. By the way, for the record, the whole notion of university versus college has been going on as long as I've been here. So that's nothing new. It's a marketing positioning thing more than anything else. But I'll tell you what, when it comes to the notion of being a Dominican university college, whatever you want to call yourself, the only way I really know how to foster that gift is to continue to give it. So for me, it would be whenever faculty are here, that should be one of the focus areas. And I have an example for you. So last spring, I was asked, would I talk about the notion of community in the classroom? And so I actually held a little workshop about how to foster a community in the classroom through your activities in the classroom, through your activity with your fellow faculty members in your department or across departments, depending on, who you are. I also believe that when it comes to the students, to actually give them a lecture on the Dominican colloquial or the Dominican educational method, it doesn't work. But to engage them and intentionally show where in your curriculum you've infused study, reflect, and act, where you've infused conversations about partnership, community, justice. Those computer science, as Vince would like to say, no, even something a hard science like computer science, there are moments where it belongs. It's not forced. It just naturally evolves into those conversations. I know that happens with my students. I know that they do think about the ethical use of information. They are privileged. One of the things that we've talked a lot about with them over the 4 years in computer science is they have a sense of privilege because they have knowledge that many people don't have. And they have a responsibility with that privilege. And what they do with that privilege, and that they will be faced from time to time being asked to do something that does not work well with their own personal values, and how will they handle it? So in other words, it's not an artificial conversation. It's a conversation that has them reflect on that particular context, or will bring a challenge associated with technology, that assistive technology, for example. Where does that fit into the broader scheme of things? What is our responsibility as purveyors of technology? We've had conversations about the fact that I've asked them to listen to podcasts about this particular topic, and less than enthusiastic response to it. And so I pulled out the learning cell inventory one day and had them do it. Oh, wouldn't you know, they're almost all visual learners, not auditory learners. Okay, switch gears. Instead, I had them watching videos. They were out looking at YouTube, high quality YouTube conversations like TEDx and things like that. But what they saw me model was not, oh, that's a problem. They saw me model, I have learned something about you. I have reflected upon it, and now I have acted on your behalf by making a pivot in what I was asking them to do. Sometimes I do techniques, for example, in the classroom, where I want them to reflect upon what class has been like, but I use art. So I start the piece of art, meaning I have a flip chart piece. I start a piece of art, like I do a squiggle or and they have to pick up a sentiment marker and they have to add to it. And the picture ends up being the display of them connecting to each other as they leave the classroom. Now, I do it for lots of educational reasons, crazy as it sounds. But I've had faculty ask me, because they've seen these pictures out on the floor, and they went, what is that? Well, that's actually a display of how the students walk out of class. This is what some of their connections were. And I've had students ask me to bring them back at the end of the semester so they can go through and watch, look at their learning journey for that semester and the connectiveness of that semester. I had actually a set of graduating students who actually asked me to bring them to the final presentation because they wanted to talk about their pictures. Now, all that is taking study, reflect, and act and modeling it to the students. It's not forced. They thought it was hilarious. Actually, the latest group of students wanted me to do it as a video. So I went and found a piece of Canadian rock song and Life is a Highway by Tom Cochrane for the record. And I fed some of his music, part of his music, with their flip chart pieces. And they just loved it. So where do I see this in the future? I think every time we talk to faculty, every time students hear these stories, it sets them on the path of study, reflect, and act, which is the core essence of what it means to get the Dominican education. We ask our computer science students that they have to actually answer that question as part of their public presentation at the end of their degree. What is it meant to be an college student? When we ask them to write about it, we also ask them to talk about it. And there's a reason for that, because we really do want them to come away from here, not because, yes, of course they've got a good degree. Yeah, got a job. But they've also had a journey of learning. And that's important.
So if I could just ask you one final question.
Sure.
Is there any wisdom you would like to impart before we finish our conversation?
No matter what background, no matter what faith tradition, no matter what your experience has been in educational environments, excuse me, come to Edgewood with an open mind and an open heart. You'll be amazed at who you become at the end of the 4 years.
And it sounds like a little bit of that happened to you as well.
Absolutely. It is. It is what draws me here. And thank you very much for sending out the invite to come in, because it was a lot of fun for me, because after all, the only motto I have in the classroom is, if you're not having fun, why are you bothering? It was a lot of fun for me to reflect on what is way too many years, when I actually realized how many years it was, way too many years, but all of the fun things that have happened here and all the wonderful people I've got to know over the years as well.
Oh, Kathleen, thank you very much for sharing those reflections with us.
More than welcome.